Hello, Goodman Games fans. Welcome to a very special episode of the Scrivenery. It is Romance of the Cyclops Con. And in honor of the timing for that, we are bringing in a special guest for tonight's episode. I'm sure that to the Goodman Games community, he needs no introduction, but I will introduce him as the guy who is single-handedly responsible for converting me to DCC. Ladies and gentlemen, Brendan LaSalle.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Absolutely. With me, as always, is my co-host, Trevor.
Hey, everybody. How are you doing tonight?
And, a few weeks ago, we talked about one of the things that is a common thing that one might publish would be a campaign world, and we delved into that. Well, tonight we're going to look in a different direction of probably, I suspect, the most common third-party publication type, which is the adventure module. And Goodman Games published some time ago a guide called How to Write Adventure Modules That Don't Suck. And so we're going to kind of delve into that very same line of reasoning tonight, and we're going to have a discussion about what makes for a good adventure publication.
Sounding good.
All right.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, Ed, I ran a poll recently on the DCC Rocks website, Facebook site. And actually, I was just pulling it up. But, did you know that adventures, I asked the DCC community, what are the things that you feel you most need? And adventures blew past everything else, which actually kind of surprised me. But I mean, it was kind of 5-1. The poll was something like, 20 or 30 people were like, yeah, we definitely want adventures, and everything else had 3 or 4 hits after that. So it was 4 or 5-1. People wanted adventures over everything else, which is I think kind of interesting and telling. And I'll definitely take that as some feedback. But this, I think, is a really timely thing: is how can we as third-party publishers, craft really great adventures that capture people's imaginations. And I mean, we've got Brandon here with us tonight, and he's known for many great adventures that are done, that are DCC products.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
So just as a jumping off point, I'm going to take a list of points that the Dark Master himself made in the aforementioned publication in terms of things that he thinks of and looks for in a submission of an adventure. And so I thought we'd start off with some of those, and I felt like that would be those would be good springboards for conversation. So his first point, which I really liked, he said, a sense of the fantastic. So
absolutely.
What does that mean to you guys?
Well, I feel like, you can never forget that our roots are weird fantasy, and never forget where we came from and what the entire game is kind of like based around bringing people, So I think that you really have to, you can't just do a straight up, heist adventure or something like that in standard DCC. I think you have to have something in there that is going to be absolutely extraordinary. It's going to be a little bit weird, but sort of mind-blowing, have that magical factor. I recently tried writing a thing for, without getting into all of it, a part of a larger adventure. And they basically were like, well, imagine how this would work if you went and did it. So I came up with a scheme for these evil villains, and I started writing it, and I realized this is a scheme that can happen in the real world. And it was dry. It came off really badly. So I had to go back, did something I rarely do, tear it up and start from scratch and just layer in the fantasy elements, because that's what we're about. It didn't feel right. And if you don't do that, it won't feel right and it won't play right.
Yeah, one of the things that I've always told when I explain to people who aren't gamers, when I explain to people what are the appeals about RPGs in general, one of the things I always say is you get to do things you can't do in real life. And so I think that having opportunities of that and having pieces of that in whatever the adventure is, opportunities to exercise that things I don't get to do in real life is probably a part of this.
No, absolutely. I agree. I think that to be able to do them and also to be able to witness them, I think that that's one of the things that you can do in a role-playing game with the unlimited effects budget of your mind. You can describe the 100-foot tall sorcerer, you know what I mean, who's, breathing living flame or whatever it happens to be, that you can put all that stuff out there right into your players' brains. And I think that for a good thing for if you're doing a DCC adventure, DCC compatible, I think that's something the audience really wants.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of really good places that we can go for that kind of sense of fantastic. For those of you who aren't sure what that feels like, right? There's a huge body, especially 20th century and 19th century literature in the weird and fantastic, not just limited to Appendix N, but broader than that. I mean, the number of short story artists, authors and everything that have produced works over the last 200 years is vast and broad, and extends beyond the obvious. People like Howard or Lovecraft or Carcass and Smith or anything, right? I mean, you can look at their influences and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at there is a series of modern art writers, kind of what Ramsey Campbell and everything referred to as the generation after Lovecraft, like the people who inherited Lovecraft's sense of style and stuff. So there's a vast potential seeding ground for you to go out and read really wonderful atmospheric short stories to give you some input into what fantastic looks like. I'm not saying you should just rip them off wholeheartedly, but I mean, definitely to give you that sense of grounded scale.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Studying the masters and learning their ways will help you develop your ways. And studying how they create the fantastic will teach you how to create your fantastic and how to express that to your readers, your GMs, and your players.
Yeah,
Most definitely, Trevor.
And reading those people, and it will allow you to figure out where your niche sits, right? Do I fit into that kind of, like, to think of DCC authors like that Stephen Newton, H.P. Lovecraft weird fiction, that is got elder gods and stuff, or do I fit into the craziness of X-Crawl or things like that, right? I kind of look at especially the Dungeon Crawl Classics era, the last 35 modules or so, as really there's veins within the Goodman product line.
Sure, absolutely.
And those veins follow not just Appendix N authors, but a specific, trending series of authors who all build on each other. So, one of the things that I do is look for an author that I really like, and then go figure out what authors they like, right? And that's a good way to figure out, to broaden your horizons and everything.
No, totally.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
So
don't forget fantasy art too. Dig into fantasy art. I can't recommend that enough.
Absolutely. There's a Rights in Peace right there behind my shoulder. And it's a Frankenstein. You can barely see it, but cover your walls in art and books.
Obviously, anytime you can put dinosaurs and spaceships together,
That's right.
and a guy with a blunderbuss, I can't.
Right.
So,
yeah, I've definitely taken cases where I've used a piece of artwork as a jumping point for, oh my gosh, this spawned an idea in my mind, and I wrote an adventure around it.
No,
yeah,
fully.
and it doesn't even have to be just art and literature. I've used music, right? And I believe Brandon's talked extensively about music in the past on other podcasts.
Yeah.
But I ran a 3-year campaign in D&D using Iron Maiden's Seventh Son of the Seventh Son, right? Wonderful, wonderful concepts woven into that kind of prog rock masterpiece.
Now, all of these things that we've mentioned, just one caveat I'll put out, just because a really horrible experience that I ran into. I was in an event at Origins, and someone who was very obviously an inexperienced GM was running an event, and we started into the setting and nothing happened, and hours went by and nothing really happened, and the players kind of had to nudge the thing along. And as she eventually kind of explained, oh, there was this one song, I don't remember what the song was, but it sounded to her like this neat fantastical kind of thing, and so she used it as a setting for an adventure, but there was no actual adventure. So
Yeah.
it's a good springboard, but build on
you
it.
can start with it, but you can't, the songs require a different kind of attention than an adventure module does. You can sit there and just enjoy a soundscape or a description of a planet or someplace crazy. But if there's if there's nothing to do there, then there's nothing to do there. So, but that's another really important part. I mean, skipping ahead down the list here, but that's another really part. Don't ever forget that this is a fantasy adventure game, and you can, there doesn't necessarily have to be violence, but there absolutely have to be choices and decisions and challenges. There have to be things for your characters to be doing. Otherwise, your players aren't going to be engaged, and they're just going to, and you'll have a problem like Ed here had his game, and it will not.
Right. All right. So another item on the list was it was described as hard work on thinking out great encounters. And as further explanation of this, it was providing what the buyer doesn't already have. If there's something that a GM already has or a GM can do without buying your product, there's no reason for them to get your product. Provide them something that is something they don't already have because it's got some depth to it, because it's something very new and imaginative. And I think that one of the things that really dovetails in with this, and I'll hook it in with the next point, says new twists on old classics. This is one of the things that I found so attractive about DCC. I started playing D&D in 1980, and after decades, I had everything memorized. There was nothing everything was predictable. The game had lost its sense of wonderment to me. DCC's one thing, it's kind of random element on certain things, but also just there aren't standard magic items. There aren't standard, there are prototype monsters, but there's a very point made that this should be just a starting point. And I think those things that add some depth to what it is that's going on and some unpredictability to what is going on is the one thing that's can make it very appealing for someone to use.
I can't agree more. I think that DCC, we very often kind of get put in the same category as OSR games, but I disagree. We're weird fantasy. We're a different thing removed from that. And I think it's both a catalyst that created the OSR, but it's also a reaction to at this point where, it's show them something they haven't seen before, turn it around, twist things up, you know what I mean? And that's a huge part of your job as a designer. All the classics, the classic adventures are fantastic and they're out there, but they can buy those. They can get those on PDF. They can do something, they're available for you without doing too much work. But give them something they haven't seen yet as much as you can. Now, obviously, there's no such thing as an original idea, but you can take all of the elements that are out there and put them together in a new way, add things, take away things in order to make it, kind of feel fresh and to have, to have all kinds of, I don't know, all kinds of really it's about making those wonderful variations on the original themes, to give it that sense of freshness, wonderment, and that idea where you can't know what's around the corner. You can't guess what the monster is. I run my demo game, and the question I always get from 5e players is, well, can I make a roll so maybe I know something about what this monster is? And I'm like, this is the only one that's ever existed. This is a creature of chaos. You know what I mean? And they're like, they just,
Yeah, some people are paralyzed with fear. For me, that's exciting as anything,
yeah, exactly. But again, that's the DCC thing, and that's what if you're going to be doing DCC third parties, I think it's super important.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. The thing that attracted me to DCC was the permutations, right? It isn't a dragon. It's not a green dragon. It's not a gold dragon. It's a dragon, and it's the dragon, and it's completely different than any other dragon. And so, the especially for the larger creatures, the things that are more memorable, hopefully, having all those permutations and tables and stuff to really generate a unique giant, for instance, is a phenomenal thing. And so,
Oh yeah.
making sure that there is uniqueness in every one of those monsters. I mean, it gets you completely away from I cannot tell you, and I agree with you completely, Ed. I've played 3rd edition, 2nd edition, and it gets really, really tough to play when players can quote back a monster manual to you, right? And when they're thinking so linearly in a game that they are metagaming every moment. They're like, okay, this is a mummy. I need to do this. I need to do that. I need to do that, because they know exactly what the limits of that creature are.
Mm-hmm.
That completely, at that point, to me, that's a board game. I might as well be playing
Talisman.
Yeah, that's Talisman. You're absolutely right. I mean, you pull over an orc and they're like, okay, so it's an orc with a strength 3. Let's just roll some dice, and half the time it's going to kill me and half the time it's not. And so when I started playing DCC, and there was that you cannot predict what a thing looks like. You cannot predict what it actually can do, and everything. That was suddenly very exciting. And so I think that comes to that memorable encounters concept that the Dark Master talked about, is always having the unknown and not completely being able to predict what happened happens in either the environment or the adversaries you face. That's a huge component. And I agree with you, Brandon, that ties in really well, not with the OSR scene, but with the idea that we're grounding things in weird fantasy, as and as Michael Shea talked about, all weird fantasy that he wrote considered it to be horror, right? And so I see this consistently through the DCC, official publications. There is an underlying kind of horror component to it all. The monsters you encounter are horrific. The encounters are horrific. They're weird. They're strange. They should drive you mad, right?
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think you're right about the setting too. What you just said is totally dead on. When you talk about an encounter, it's not just the monsters, it's where you're fighting them, it's the environment that they're in. And I think that, coming up with a really interesting place for a battle is just as cool. It can be just as thrilling as, coming up with a new monster. You know what I mean? I think that, whatever it happens to be, I ran a thing this morning fighting on an ice bridge, you know what I mean? And I really was digging how that was, turning out. And, so I don't know, it's I think that's really important as well, putting things in as many settings as, not just even settings, but specific designs of a specific room. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think that can be just as thrilling to fight a thing in a space like you've never seen before. That can be really fun.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think one way that a good way to describe that, and as I'm looking at some of the other points, one of the following points that he makes is he says a strong narrative feel. When I very first started getting into getting some of the published official DCC modules, I was a little bit concerned that it's going to be nothing but a hack and slash dungeon crawl. And I was pleasantly surprised to see every single one of them had some kind of story to it, some kind of purpose, some kind of point. There is, wherever your adventure is taking place, it existed before the player characters come along. Why was it there? What's the backstory of it? And as part of that, then how do the players fit into that, or the characters fit into that? And I often tell people that, to me, the point of playing, and everybody's got different reasons, I understand that, but to me, the point of playing an RPG is to tell a great story. Not as a GM. The GM facilitates storytelling. The players tell the story, and years later, they don't remember, some little detail, this and that. They remember the story, the grand story that they told, the heroic tale that they told by virtue of what their characters were doing. And exotic and memorable opponents, treasures, environments, these things all help to make those stories memorable.
So to me, Ed, the critical crux there is kind of one word: context, right? So the environment creates context, the adversary creates context, the history of that environment and that adversary create context, and that context needs to be, what I see as the judge's purview is to telegraph context, right? Without that ability to telegraph context, you can't tell a great story, right? It's the difference between saying you walk down a corridor and you walk down the corridor, there's things dripping from the walls, there's slime mold here, there's a pictogram that's been carved into the wall. Well, what does that look like? It looks like this. You find some, you find some goblin feces or something, right? So you know something's living down here. And so context is what creates the great storytelling to me. And that's what I look for in a great story, in a great module, right? Something that and what I really like, and Brandon, I don't know what you think about this, but I really like the ability for different players to pick up on different contextual clues and be able to play off those separately, and then be able to communicate those to each other, right? To me, that's why we have things like creatures that, player characters that can see in infravision versus regular vision, or can smell gold, right? Those contextual clues that each of those characters brings to the game are really, really important.
Yeah, and you're right. Those little details create verisimilitude, and those little details make your world have depth. And when they're in a situation that has depth, they're engaged. Your players are going to be engaged, and they're going to feel like this is, happening. That's why it's the curse of the 10-foot by 10-foot corridor. You know what I'm saying? You're like, oh God, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, like, oh, again, so it's cool to, I don't know, it's cool to put those things in there. And I would say a part of, for a designer, and this is actually something I really struggle with, it's really good to try to learn as many new architectural terms as you possibly can. Learn like the terms for all, 90% of the stuff that I learned from running other D&D modules, you know what I'm saying, when I was a kid. I remember having to look up alcove. You know what I mean? Like, oh, there's an alcove. Can you, is the door shut behind you when you walk into an alcove? But like, look those up as like, I spent a lot of time like trying to, running Google searches, like the name for the little bar at the top of the door. You know what I mean? Or whatever happens to Lindell. I know, right? So that's fairly recent though for me. That's, you know what I mean? I had to look that one up. So, so those are having those in your descriptions can be really important and really good.
Right.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, Brendan. I mean, think about a church, right? Churches, especially if you're modeling it after, real world structures, which is a good grounding so that you can then have fantastic playing off of it. They're built for a very specific reason, right? They face certain directions, certain cardinal directions. They have naves. They have, they have all of these little spaces within them that have significance and meaning. And so, for instance, I mean, I've seen several of those play out in Goodman Games adventures and everything, where they talk about these structures, right? And so, if you look at it, a well-designed building, a well-designed space, often is grounded. And you're right; those real-world terms mean something.
So another thing that I think really contributes to the narrative and the uniqueness of what we put together. One of Joseph's other points was a good villain. Personally, I've got kind of a penchant for criminally insane villains, and having something to do with the history of a situation, or maybe you even run into them in some manner. I have a number of modules where there's someone who went off the deep end on their megalomania. But anyway, a villain, basically in video game terms, you think of it as a boss monster. But anyway, a villain that produces a climax to the adventure that has depth to it. That has oh yes, my wife just mentioned the witch from the very first campaign I ran, who dogged their steps for years and years. So yeah, a villain that's got that's got a lot of layers to them, I think adds a lot to being able to present that narrative and also bring out some real hatred from the characters, because they get to the point where, oh my gosh, I can't, I want to destroy this entity.
Yeah, it's the creating a villain that your players hate is an art. You know what I mean? That's a real, you get 3 or 4 of them maybe in a career, and you think, oh, they really hate this guy, and that is wonderful. In my old, I started the first game I ever ran was Villains of Vigilantes. I was like superhero obsessed when I was a kid. And I had this one villain, and it was the Mime. And like he was a telekinetic, and he could like make a wall that you couldn't get through and such. You never saw players lose their minds to get at a bad guy. And because of that, I could like use him to distract these guys over here, and then they would come at me from the other. They hated him so much, and I feel like I was like, oh, I was a kid. You know what I mean?
Dude, I did that same thing. I had a clan of ninja mimes in a superhero game. Oh, good.
Tony mentioned the Emperor of the Moon from an adventure. So far, only a convention adventure I run, but that's yeah, man. The people really hate the Emperor of the Moon, and I have a lot of fun role playing him. He's one of those villains that, like, if I'm going to do that, I practice him in the mirror a time or two before I go to a show. Yeah. So thanks.
So Brandon, what do you think are the essential components of a good villain? I mean, do they need to have an agenda? Do they need to that players can respond to? One of the things that I've always heard is a good villain is an individual who believes in what they're doing, doesn't necessarily have a different viewpoint than the players or the characters, the protagonist, but is just willing to go to different means to achieve them, right? And so when your characters actually agree with that villain, that's much more impactful. They just can't handle the methodology, right? What do you do to create some of that tension?
Well, to sometimes I will give. I feel okay, like, I don't know, letting the villain sort of like reframe the world in their mind. You know what I mean? That's sort of where I begin. Like, this is somebody who. If they're villain because they have made a decision. They don't think they're a villain. They think they're the hero of their own story. You know what I mean? Except when they know they're the villain, and that can be really fun too when you break that. You know what I'm saying? But for the most part, you put someone out there. I think of Mutant Crawl Classics. I think of I really wanted to create a reoccurring character for that. So the chief villain of my first Mutant Crawl adventure, she in her mind, like, destroying all other sentient life on Earth except for herself absolutely is not just makes sense, it's the only thing that makes sense. You know what I mean? So she, in her mind, she's doing the right thing, and you're the fly in the ointment. Yeah. I think that giving a villain a motivation like that, I think is very important. I think I try to very often think in terms of like a smaller story. Like what are people really, like what do our real villains want? Pretty much it's things to gratify their ego, things to keep themselves secure and safe, and things to alter the world in the way that they think it should be altered. You know what I mean? Whatever that means, But I think beyond that, I think you have to make your characters look real. Like the villains, they have to stand out. They have to have some flavor to them. You know what I'm saying? We've had enough. I mean, Darth Vader clone villains out there that if you're going to do a Darth Vader clone villain, I think you can do it, but you have to really think of how you're going to make them, different.
Right.
To me, I figure in my mind, there's 2 categories of villains. Here's some look behind the Brendan curtain here. The 2 categories of villains for me are articulate and non-articulate,
Okay,
and that's a really big distinction for me. Like the kind of villain that you will have that will at the end have that monologue with you and like reveal their plan,
The Thanos.
Yeah. The Thanos is that's a great example. You know what I mean? Someone who you can then argue with. You know what I mean? And give him that moment of, and of real fury when he sees that you're just never going to see things the way that you are, and clearly you're wrong. Or then there's your inarticulate villain who still has their agenda, but they're not going to. That's your Jason Voorhees, your Godzilla. You know what I'm saying? Like these people who are just doing what they do. So when I sit down to do it, if I'm thinking of the big bad for this thing, am I making a talky bad guy, or am I making, and inarticulate can be a cosmic force entity that just you can't comprehend or understand, or some kind of slime creature that is just seeking to devour everything that's in its way. I start with that. I start by thinking to myself, is this a villain that I want them to have a conversation with before they kill it, or is this something that doesn't want to be like that? Once I have that down, that to me really will, figuring how they communicate and how they communicate to the players is how they'll relate to the players, whether they're going to speak to them, fight with them, or avoid them and just try to send tricks from afar. So that's my first step, is thinking to myself, how is this person going to communicate to the players? Will they only communicate through violence, or will we be speaking, or are we doing other, villainous things? Is it the sneaky background villain you never see until eventually in the last episode, you pull back the curtain and there he is throwing levers, So I start with that. And then I think to myself, what's their motivation? What are they trying to do? And then just try to give them flavor, Don't forget that, again, even if they're villains, they'll have some things that are relatable to, okay, not, either they do and they're a humanish kind of villain, or they don't, and it's, again, your cosmic weirdness, your horrific monsters, or your abominations, your things that you just can't understand their motivations because they're so alien to what you are. Sometimes really, that's the existential thing, that those really alien ones that you just can't, where you just can't fathom their motivations. That can be really, that's a whole branch of horror, so.
Right.
Well, and as from a standpoint of design, if you're thinking in terms of this, especially from the focus villain, have it be built and placed intelligently. Keep in mind that every living thing that exists wants to not be destroyed, and will go to just about any means to stay undestroyed. It's going to have safeguards, whatever. Even a fox or whatever in a field has 2 exits from its burrow. Your boss monster, so to speak, your villain that's the focus of the adventure, unless they're so whacked out that they don't really have any kind of connection, but they probably thought a few things through, and have their situation designed so that there's some layers to the challenge associated with them.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that will also make them feel real. Like if you come across this crazy, the big bad villain of the entire campaign, I call this the TikTok man syndrome. You come across the great big villain of the campaign and he goes out like a chump. Like that doesn't feel real. You know what I mean? That should have been much harder. Now, sometimes, dice rolls are dice rolls. Sometimes things happen, but they should have, contingencies. It should be very hard to actually get to them, or they should be just so, and this is the case though, too. Sometimes they can be just so supernaturally overconfident. They just don't see what's coming up, but whatever it is, that has to be a factor, how you consider them, how they layer their defenses, how hard it will be to get to them, how they'll fight back. That's that's half the fun is, creating your security onion around your bad guys, you know what I'm saying? And like all of the things that you have to do to get to blah,
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So the next line that I want to take us down is, there are many different types of adventures. And so what is the style of your adventure, and what is the target audience that you're aiming that towards? Different game groups or different GMs will have different predilections towards the type of thing that they like to do. Some game groups are very big into heavy role play. Some game groups are very big into problem solving. Some are very big into combat after combat. I think from a standpoint of a publication, I feel like it's important that it's evident to the buyer which one of these your publication is, or is it a mix of these things, so that they know what they're getting. And so if I run a group of if I run a gaming group that is heavily focused on one of these, then I know, oh, you've got an adventure that's really going to fit well for our group.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you're talking about making sure that it's like that it's quickly apparent to the GM what's going on here, that they're not going to be, you're not going to sell them A and give them B. You're going to make it like, where they know, oh, this is a dungeon crawl, this is a heist thing, this is we're on the run for months, this is a escape from imprisonment kind of adventure. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Yeah. So have your product description convey a sense of what kind of, what style of adventure you've got, not just the is it, oh, it's gothic horror versus, but also I feel like it's helpful in your description to give some kind of hint, maybe not necessarily coming out in direct words and saying this is a very role play heavy adventure, but you could say that for the GM's sake, for the purchaser's sake, or have something about your description text convey the sense that, oh, this is an absolute bloodbath, or this one, there's a lot of politics and political intrigue involved, so that the buyer understands what they're getting, and so that it's going to end up in a gaming group that is going to be a good fit for it, because that's how you're going to make gaming groups happy.
Yep, I think you're right. I think there's a real art to writing a product description. And what I do is I write one and then I send it in, and then I'm told how wrong it is. And then I start again, and I just keep doing it over and
over again, right?
Yeah, it's been challenging for me to do it. It really is. It's a real art to it, and I am a disciple, not a master of it. And I feel like it's something I've been working on for a long time. And I'm certainly better than I was, but it's hard. Writing it, like, to me, like the elevator pitch, that's hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
So, my background's in academia, as is Ed's. And to me, that product pitch, that back page blurb feels a lot like an abstract for a scientific article, mm-hmm. right? And one of the, I don't know about you, Ed, but one of the first things I was trained to do was write your abstract last, right? I mean, you shouldn't write your elevator pitch before you know what the elevator looks like. And so I might outline it, but I'm definitely mm-hmm. going to revise it at the end to say, oh, I really had no goblins in there, so I should probably take the line about you're going to fight forest goblins out, because that's absolutely not relevant. Mm-hmm. To me, that pitch only really is able to be really well written once you know what the product actually entails, right?
Oh, I agree. I always write my product description after the manuscript is done. Always.
I mean, Brandon, do you guys do it differently? I mean, is that?
Oh no! Hey, the process is I turn the manuscript in, and I'm like, "Woo, that's done. That's out of my hands. All right." And then I get an email the next day. We need a back cover blurb, and I'm like, why? And then I'm like, and then it takes me 3 hours of like at least an hour of which is going, why the hell do I go? It's very. That's hard for me. It really, really is. It's, so yeah, it's, I would do that last. I never worked from that. Sometimes, I don't know though, sometimes with X-Crawl, I will say, I think it'll sort of like come to me earlier, but that's because I've done so many, there's a format for X-Crawl type things. And it's kind of like, I now that I've done it enough times, as I'm doing it, sometimes I'll start seeing in my head, oh, that'll be a funny thing. So I'll kind of like sketch out elements of it, but I don't ever do it until it's all done and turned over, and they make me.
Well, and let's be honest, X-Crawl has a certain characteristic about it that if you're buying an X-Crawl adventure, you may not know the particulars of how it plays out, but you have a certain sense of what kind of nature of gameplay that you're getting,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I just saw something in the chat. I guess coming back to when we were talking about villains, you can also set it up so that even if the villain is defeated, they've already enacted enough of their plans to still be a problem. You want to talk about making a villain that the players will hate? That gets you some real mileage right there.
Oh yeah, yeah. And you know, I don't know. I've done a couple of villains. I've done a couple of adventures where the premise of the adventure is that the villain scheme it's already done. They've already won, and now you're just sort of like wading through to see how it does. I always have a lot of fun with that, and I always try to make it something the kind of thing that you really have to go the extra mile to unravel and go, oh my gosh, we've been in this world the whole time, you know. That's a challenge, but yeah, I love the idea of the schemes that are ongoing. You know, sometimes, you know, it's in a fantasy world, there is you always have that, well, it's magic. So, you know, you kill a villain, he comes back. Well, it was magic. You know, they magic him back and such. And I'm really appreciative of DCC that
there's
don't
no
make
resurrection.
there's no resurrection. It's not, you know, it's not like, oh, I'll read this scroll and, you know, I'll be back, you know, bring him back or whatever, you know. You know, having a villain that legitimately, you know what I mean, where you can like, you know, like come, you know, try this for like build this into their description. You know, if they really are all about winning, let them cheat and let them fake being dead and then crawl away and sneak off. I love that. That's real villain action right there. You know what I'm saying? Like he got into the garbage cans. What? You know what I mean? And then, you know, or whatever it happens.
We were fighting an illusion the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah. Or, you know, like, you know, something where you can't do that every time, you know what I mean? But like, I love the idea of them slipping through your fingers. You know what I mean? To me, that's a really good kind of villain, you know. I don't know. And yeah, speaking of slipping through your fingers here, Slipping Finger says, you can set it up just so that even if the villain is defeated, they've already enacted enough of their plans to still be a problem. And that's, yeah, you can you know, totally do that as well.
And I love adventures where you have to make a choice, right? Do we defeat the villain or do we defeat the villain's plan, right? And so that's really great because it's like, well, we're going to let him go in order to save the town, or we're going to let the town die so we can defeat the villain because we know he's going to go on and destroy a couple more towns, right? And so those kinds of quandaries, those XY track, you know, train quandaries of who dies and who doesn't, and making those hard choices really make for good drama, right? And that makes a great adventure.
Well, and one of the more broader ways that you could describe that would be give your players opportunities to tell the story. You know, I was listening to an interview. There's this guy called RPG Pundit, and someone was interviewing him, and the person who was interviewing said something to the effect of the GM's job is to tell a story. And he said, no. The GM's job is to present us an environment. The players tell the story. And I totally agree with that. And the more opportunities that you provide for players to tell the story by virtue of making choices, so that they become the scribes of the narrative, I think that's very powerful in terms of making that adventure memorable for the players, making it something that they'll be talking about for a long time. That villain, you know, like Sun had mentioned in the chat, the witch, one of the things that was a real issue there was time and again came back again and again. Even after they killed her, then she came back as a succubus. I mean, when they finally destroyed that villain for good, it was, you know, that was a moment that everybody remembers, you know.
Oh, I fully get that. Now the trick is, because you're talking that's a GM's choice. You know, the trick is how do you relate that to the GM in your product when you're writing an adventure? How do you, let them know this is a villain that should be slippery? I mean, I won't say that is the trick. You should do that. If that's what you're going for, articulate that and let them decide how best that should be enacted. You know, this villain should be tricky and should be able to escape from most things. Perhaps they do this, or this, but you know, the first encounter with them shouldn't be the last. They should be able to, you know, if there's a reasonable way for them to sneak out and escape, then they should go ahead and do that. You know,
when you can provide some potential mechanisms that they've got in mind. Again, there's a background. Part of that background is the plans and thoughts that they have. So go ahead and detail those in your product. and or at least some ideas in that respect. The GM may take it and run it in a different direction, but at least if they have that emphasize that, yeah, this is the nature of this enemy.
So I find that there's a fine line there when, I've read a lot of different products, and that kind of a like AI type discussion about what the reactions of a great villain or any bad guy any adversary you have in your campaign, right? Or in your story, even if it's the Minotaur guard standing at the door, right? That discussion about what they're going to do or how they're going to react needs to be managed, and that's a fine writing tool, right? And so there's a fine edge to that. Are we giving you paragraphs, in which case I have to wade through it to figure it out as the judge, or are you giving me like if-then statements in bullet form? So if the players try this, then they're going to do this, and giving some to help frame that adversary without overwhelming the judge with a set of decisions that they feel like they have to adhere to, right? So, to me, that's a real fine, there's a fine line between overdoing that.
Valid point.
Absolutely. And I think that, less is usually more. I won't say always, but less is usually more. And I think that's not even adventure design, that's writing. I think you want to find a way to condense any point you have to make into the absolute smallest package you can put it in, but not make it any smaller than that. Put it in the just right size thing. And that's a writing thing, and that is something you will go up against your entire career as a writer. Everything everything you're sitting down and doing. If you think about it, if so much of the adventure design stuff is really dictated. What you can do is completely dictated by your word count. If you've got can do a 10,000 word adventure, then you can't write a full page of strategy for what your mastermind villain is going to do in every contingency situation. What you can do is say he's a genius, he might use this, and this, but you can't, you just can't do it. There's the one epic level adventure I wrote, the one serious criticism I saw laid at it a couple of times is I wish he had showed us a little bit more, I wish there had been more discussion of the strategy of all these villains. And I was 20,000 words over word count because it was a stupid epic level thing and these stat blocks are 2 pages. But mostly it was like you just can't, when you're talking about that level of things, you just can't discuss every contingency. You can say, this can go a lot of ways. Play these things super smart. These are geniuses here who are going to enact a really good strategy and who are going to be able to predict what the players are most likely going to do. But you can't, you can give them like, if you're going to go if then, maybe 2 or 3, you know what I'm saying? And like in a paragraph, like boom. And beyond that, at a certain point, you're telling the GM how to run his game. I try not to do that. I want to give suggestions. I want to help them. I want to give them a play set and give them toys to move around, but it's your game and I want you to do it your way.
Right. This isn't one of those endless quest books where there's 3 different options. The GM and the players both have to feel free to make completely open choices.
Word.
One other point I'll quickly make, Trevor had talked about finding that balance. And I think one way I would want to extend that would be, we're talking a lot of focus about a primary villain, a boss monster, so to speak. Not every creature should have a weird twist. Not every creature should have, these, oh, look, it's back again. Oh, look, this thing we killed is not really dead.
Yeah.
Use those sorts of things, but use them from time to time. If it's every single time, then that becomes predictable.
Yeah. No, you're totally right. Sometimes a funny twist is something that's like aggressively mundane.
Right.
I love putting in the thing like, the villain who is undone because he refuses to not ride into town for coffee every day or something like that. You know what I mean? Something that he just really, or he just forgot. You know what I mean? Or whatever it happened to be. Sometimes that can be really interesting. And, you don't see a whole lot of that. I think playing with the mundane within the fantastical, the phrase you'll see like in literature for that is like magical realism. You know what I mean? Like, what would it actually be like, to what would it actually be like to be this person with all of this power and these resources and this villainous agenda? You know, you can't keep track of everything. I think it can be fun to kind of like let them, you know, even the real smart ones are going to mess up on something, and that can be a really interesting thing, I think, to do. You know,
the contrast that it creates.
Yeah.
All right. So the last thing that I want to take a look at is one of the things that that'll be a characteristic of a publication is what is the play length? And you know, I've got three broad categories here. One will be something that's a long thing that's part of a campaign. Less than that would be maybe an adventure that's multi-session. You know, I'm thinking of for the old Against the Giants modules, something like that. And then shorter still would be something that's meant for a single convention length session. Maybe even, and in fact, a lot of the things that I've written have been very specifically sized so that you could do it in a convention setting. And you know, there's a demand for that. And so, anyway, it's one thing that I'll point out that is critical. You got to play test this to get that. You may think, oh, this is something that is a 7-hour thing, and you know, you run through 3 play tests and everyone gets through in a half hour, or vice versa. You know, so any thoughts about length of adventure
or play testing?
Right, or play testing.
Okay, well, play testing, that's a no-brainer. You know, there's almost no amount of play testing that is too much. I've never, if there is, I've never come across that. And my best adventures are the ones that I got to run a whole lot of times on the road before I have, you know, tried to put them to paper. And like, you know, a big part of my process is that I just work off of notes while I'm in the playtest process. You know what I'm saying? I don't like some GMs will, and again, here's the thing, you got to find your own way to it as a designer. Okay. I've got my way, you'll have your way, but you can learn a lot. You can learn your way by learning somebody else's way and seeing how they do it. Then you try it, you go, okay, that's not for me. But you know, that's how you learn about what your own thing should be. But so for me, I just work off of notes until I've play tested a thing. I mean, the minimum I'm comfortable with is like 4 minutes, like 4 times. That's the bare minimum. And that means me running it 3 times and getting a friend of mine or another judge to run it at least once. You know what I'm saying? That's the bare minimum, you know? But as far as adventure length goes, I mean, that's key. I tend to write really, like, I love one-shot adventures. I tend to do, I'm a convention creature, and I you know, that's how I work all the time. But the couple of times I've had a chance to write something that was longer than that, I mean, I can get into it, you know. But you know, just know what you're doing beforehand, because that's going to change everything. You know, if you're trying to write a thing that you only do, you know, that's going to take you 6 months to run, you know, nights and weekends or whatever, then you approach it differently, and you're looking at a different, you know, you're looking at a different strategy for actually putting it all together, for arranging your information, for organizing what you're doing. So just keep it in mind beforehand. I would say that.
One other thing that I think is a real value from the play test is something that you may think, oh, they're going to have fun with this. This will be interesting, versus this is just kind of an afterthought. It's hard to, you can't necessarily predict what the players are going to find fun and interesting. And after you play test something a few times, you may find out, oh, wow, they really dug this part. I'm going to emphasize that. I'm going to, you know, maybe expand on that. And I have found that some of the things that I didn't really expect much of when I ran them at conventions were the things that people loved the most. So that's a real value from playtesting.
And if I could jump in here on that, Ed, the other value that I find that comes out of playtesting is I always pay attention to a couple different things. One is seeing if other groups solve whatever the adventure, whatever the modules, whatever the point of what you're running, if they solve it in different ways, but still appreciably get to the same, you know, to the end, the final scene, right? So, you know, if there are multiple directions to get there, that doesn't mean you have to have multiple corridors or multiple spaces. You know, I mean, I've been working on an adventure that's essentially one room, but there are multiple ways to traverse that room, and different. You know, I'm looking for groups. You know, I finally was happy with it when I found that different groups could traverse it different ways, but everybody got there, or the, you know, there was lots of variance in that, and it was still satisfactory to all those different players. So that was one thing I look for when I play test stuff, is can everybody get there even, and more importantly, is it always a different way, or is it likely a different way? If people are always going A, B, C, D, E, to me, that becomes very predictable. And it means you've probably written a linear a linear thing that you might want to consider breaking up some way. And then the other question is, are players, are they engaged in interacting with those things? I mean, so Brendan, is there a sweet spot for you? You've done a lot of play testing where you could look at it and say, do you have those same type of feelings? Like, hey, people are solving this, they're solving it in different ways. That's great.
Yeah, no, I absolutely do. And I see that we're getting the we have to get going thing, but I agree. And I think that you can, it's just one of those things. If you do it enough times, you'll see the patterns. And, you know what, have me on again. We'll get into it some more, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
Well, we could carry on for a long time, and we've had a great time with this. I want to thank Brendan for joining us, but we have hit our time limit, and we have to make way for the next show. So until we meet again for the next episode of Scrivenery, when we're going to be talking about what makes a good third-party product, catch you later, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me, guys. Absolutely.